Absalom, is a novel by the American author William Faulkner, first published in 1936. Taking place before, during, and after the American Civil War, it is a story about three families of the American South, with a focus on the life of Thomas Sutpen. William Cuthbert Faulkner, September 25, 1897 – July 6, 1962, was an American writer known for his novels and short stories set in the fictional Yoknapatawpha County, based on Lafayette County, Mississippi, where Faulkner spent most of his life. A Nobel Prize laureate, Faulkner is one of the most celebrated writers of American literature and is considered the greatest writer of Southern literature. Southern United States literature consists of American literature written about the Southern United States or by writers from the region. Literature written about the American South first began during the colonial era, and developed significantly during and after the period of slavery in the United States. Traditional historiography of Southern United States literature emphasized a unifying history of the region, the significance of family in the South's culture, a sense of community and the role of the individual, justice, the dominance of Christianity and the positive and negative impacts of religion, racial tensions, social class and the usage of local dialects. However, in recent decades, the scholarship of the New Southern Studies has decentralized these conventional tropes in favor of a more geographically, politically, and ideologically expansive, South, or Souths. In its simplest form, Southern literature consists of writing about the American South. Often, the South is defined, for historical as well as geographical reasons, as the states of South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, Kentucky, West Virginia and Arkansas. Pre-Civil War definitions of the South often included Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware as well. However, the South is also a social, political, economic, and cultural construct that transcends these geographical boundaries. Southern literature has been described by scholars as occupying a liminal space within wider American culture. After the American Revolution, writers in the U.S. from outside the South frequently othered Southern culture, in particular slavery, as a method of standing apart from the imperial world order. These negative portrayals of the American South eventually diminished after the abolition of slavery in the U.S., particularly during a period after the Spanish-American War when many Americans began to re-evaluate their anti-imperialistic views and support for imperialism grew. Changing historiographical trends have placed racism in the American South as emblematic of, rather than an exception to, U.S. racism as a whole. Thomas Sutpen is a focal character of William Faulkner's 1936 novel Absalom. Sutpen arrives in Faulkner's imaginary Yoknapatawpha County, Mississippi, in the 1830s and establishes a 64,000-acre, 100-square-mile plantation, Sutpen's Hundred, in an attempt to create his own dynasty. It is eventually revealed that Sutpen was born to a poor white family in what became West Virginia before moving to the Tidewater region of Virginia, where he was the first privy to the aristocratic plantation culture of the antebellum South. When he was 14, running errands for his father, Sutpen was instructed by a black servant to use the back door of the plantation house. This led him to renounce his family and social position. He traveled to the West Indies to build his own plantation and start a lineage, in accordance with his design. The discovery that his wife was part black, making his son Charles Bond part black, caused him to leave them behind and relocate to Yoknapatawpha County, where he built a new plantation. The sins of his past and his indiscriminate sexual practices eventually caused the downfall of his empire in the early 20th century. Summary. Absalom details the rise and fall of Thomas Sutpen, a white man born into poverty in Western Virginia who moves to Mississippi with the dual aims of gaining wealth and becoming a powerful family patriarch. The story is told entirely in flashbacks narrated mostly by Quentin Compson to his roommate at Harvard College, Shreve, who frequently contributes his own suggestions and surmises. The narration of Rosa Coldfield, and Quentin's father and grandfather, are also included and reinterpreted by Shreve and Quentin, with the total events of the story unfolding in non-chronological order and often with differing details. This results in a peeling back the onion revelation of the true story of the Sutpens. Rosa initially narrates the story, with long digressions and a biased memory, to Quentin Compson, whose grandfather was a friend of Sutpen's. Quentin's father then fills in some of the details to Quentin. Finally, Quentin relates the story to his roommate Shreve, and in each retelling, the reader receives more details as the parties flesh out the story by adding layers. The final effect leaves the reader more certain about the attitudes and biases of the characters than about the facts of Sutpen's story. Thomas Sutpen arrives in Jefferson, Mississippi, with some slaves and a French architect who has been somehow forced into working for him. Sutpen obtains 100 square miles of land from a local Native American tribe and immediately begins building a large plantation called Sutpen's 100, including an ostentatious mansion. All he needs to complete his plan is a wife to bear him a few children, particularly a son to be his heir, so he ingratiates himself with a local merchant and marries the man's daughter, Ellen Coldfield. Ellen bears Sutpen 2 children, a son named Henry and a daughter named Judith, both of whom are destined for tragedy. Henry goes to the University of Mississippi and meets fellow student Charles Bond, who is 10 years his senior. Henry brings Charles home for Christmas, and Charles and Judith begin a quiet romance that leads to a presumed engagement. However, Thomas Sutpen realizes that Charles Bond is his son from an earlier marriage and moves to stop the proposed union. Sutpen had worked on a plantation in the French West Indies as overseer and, after subduing a slave uprising, was offered the hand of the plantation owner's daughter, Eulalia Bond. She bore him a son, Charles. Sutpen did not know that Eulalia was of mixed race until after the marriage and birth of Charles, but when he discovered that he had been deceived, he renounced the marriage as void and left his wife and child, though leaving them his fortune as part of his own moral recompense. The reader also later learns of Sutpen's childhood, when young Thomas learned that society could base human worth on material worth. It is this episode that sets into motion Thomas's plan to start a dynasty. When Sutpen tells Henry that Charles is his half-brother and that Judith must not be allowed to marry him, Henry refuses to believe it, repudiates his birthright, and accompanies Charles to his home in New Orleans. They then return to Mississippi to enlist in their university company, joining the Confederate Army to fight in the Civil War. During the war, Henry wrestles with his conscience until he presumably resolves to allow the marriage of half-brother and sister. This resolution changes, however, when Sutpen reveals to Henry that Charles is part black. At the conclusion of the war, Henry enforces his father's interdiction of marriage between Charles and Judith, killing Charles at the gates to the mansion and then fleeing into self-exile. Thomas Sutpen returns from the war and begins to repair his dynasty and his home, whose 100 square miles have been reduced by carpetbaggers and punitive northern action to 1 square mile. He proposes to Rosa Coldfield, his dead wife's younger sister, and she accepts. However, Sutpen insults Rosa by demanding that she bear him a son before the wedding takes place, prompting her to leave Sutpen's 100. Sutpen then begins an affair with Millie, the 15-year-old granddaughter of Wash Jones, a squatter who lives on the Sutpen property. The affair continues until Millie becomes pregnant and gives birth to a daughter. Sutpen is terribly disappointed, because the last hope of repairing his Sutpen dynasty rested on Millie giving birth to a son. Sutpen casts Millie and the child aside, telling them that they are not worthy of sleeping in the stables with his horse, who had just sired a male. An enraged Wash Jones kills Thomas, Millie, Millie's newborn daughter, and finally himself by resisting arrest. The story of Thomas Sutpen's legacy ends with Quentin taking Rosa back to the seemingly abandoned Sutpen's 100 plantation, where they find Henry Sutpen and Clytemnestra Clitty, the daughter of Thomas Sutpen by a slave woman. Henry has returned to the estate to die. 3 months later, when Rosa returns with medical help for Henry, Clitty mistakes them for law enforcement and starts a fire that consumes the plantation and kills Henry and herself. The only remaining Sutpen is Jim Bond, Charles Bond's black grandson, a young man with severe mental handicaps, who remains on Sutpen's 100. Ending. Like other Faulkner novels, Absalom allegorizes Southern history. The title itself is an allusion to the biblical story of King David and Absalom, a wayward son fighting the empire his father built. The history of Thomas Sutpen mirrors the rise and fall of Southern plantation culture. Sutpen's failures necessarily reflect the weaknesses of an idealistic South. Rigidly committed to his design, Sutpen proves unwilling to honor his marriage to a part black woman, setting in motion his own destruction. Discussing Absalom, Faulkner stated that the curse under which the South labors is slavery, and that Thomas Sutpen's personal curse, or flaw, was his belief that he was too strong to need to be a part of the human family. Absalom, Absalom, juxtaposes ostensible fact, informed guesswork, and outright speculation, with the implication that reconstructions of the past remain irretrievable and therefore imaginative. Faulkner stated that, although none of the narrators got the facts right since no one individual can look at truth, a truth exists and that the reader can ultimately know it. Most critics have tried to reconstruct this truth behind the shifting narratives, or to show that such a reconstruction cannot be done with certainty, or even to prove that there are factual and logical inconsistencies that cannot be overcome. But some critics have stated that, fictional truth being an oxymoron, it is best to take the story as a given, and regard it on the level of myth and archetype, a fable that allows us to glimpse the deepest levels of the unconscious and thus better understand the people who accept and are ruled by that myth, Southerners in general and Quentin Compson in particular. By using various narrators expressing their interpretations, the novel alludes to the historical cultural zeitgeist of Faulkner's South, where the past is always present and constantly in states of revision by the people who tell and retell the story over time. It thus also explores the process of myth-making and the questioning of truth. Absalom, Absalom, along with The Sound and the Fury, helped Faulkner win the Nobel Prize in Literature for the year 1949. In 2009, a panel of judges called Absalom, Absalom, the best Southern novel of all time. The title refers to the biblical story of Absalom, a son of David who rebelled against his father, then king of the Kingdom of Israel, and was killed by David's general Joab in violation of David's order to deal gently with his son, thus causing heartbreak to David. The 1983 Guinness Book of World Records says the longest sentence in literature is a sentence from Absalom, Absalom, containing 1,288 words. 9. The sentence can be found in Chapter 6. It begins with the words, "just exactly like father," and ends with, "the eye could not see from any point." The passage is entirely italicized and incomplete. The final lyric of Distant Early Warning, a single released by the Canadian rock band Rush, is the word, Absalom, repeated 3 times. Drummer Neil Peart, the band's lyricist, said he loved the sound of the title of Faulkner's novel and was inspired to look up the biblical story of Absalom after reading the novel. Since one of the main themes of the song was compassion, it occurred to Met that the biblical story was applicable.